Good afternoon. I'm Frank Reedy, representing the Strategic Studies Department here at JSOW. Today, we're pleased to present an interview with a distinguished guest, including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOW network. As always, JSOW engagements are conducted with some attention to academic freedom. Keep in mind that views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, policy, or opinion of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM. If you have feedback or questions after this session, email thinkjsow@socom.mil as indicated on the slide. Today's interview is led by Mr. Karlin, Senior Faculty at the Strategic Studies Department. He will introduce the program and our guest.
Hello and good day to everyone. My name is Kyle Garland and I'm from the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOW. Think JSOW is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of JSOW faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. I encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOW collection by reviewing our online offerings on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the All Partner Access Network, or APAN. For our online attendees this afternoon, if you have a question for our guest, please submit the question using the Q&A icon on your toolbar. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Mara Karlin join us to discuss her book, Building Militaries in Fragile States, Challenges for the United States. Dr. Karlin's book was selected by the U.S. SOCOM Commander for the 2020 Commander's Reading List as part of the Strategy and War Collection. Dr. Karlin is a professor of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. She is also director of the school's Strategic Studies program, executive director of the Merrill Center for Strategic Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Previously, Dr. Karlin served in senior national security roles for 5 U.S. Secretaries of Defense. She advised on policies including strategic planning, defense budgeting, future wars in the evolving security environment, and regional affairs involving the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. Dr. Karlin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real treat.
Well, we're glad to have you, ma'am. Ma'am, defense institution building is really a key area of U.S. involvement. And as we might all imagine, it is of particular interest for United States Special Operations Command, as it is primarily Special Operations Forces that will execute much of the partner nation engagement. However, before we dive into your book, I'd really like to start off with asking you to tell our audience why you chose to write this book.
Terrific. This was not the book I wanted to write. I had spent a number of years in the Pentagon working with militaries in fragile states and tried to build them across a couple of different regions. And the book I planned to write was supposed to say, I did all this stuff. It worked really, really well. Here's the playbook, go do it. And inconveniently, the research didn't take me there. And that was sobering in a number of different ways. I kind of went with Winston Churchill's maxim, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally assess the results. And I started looking at a number of different examples, including some of the ones that I had worked on, and realized actually that the US was approaching this effort of how to build militaries in fragile states from a pretty misguided point of view. So I wrote a different book. It took me to places I hadn't expected or hadn't intended to go to, which, as I said, is terribly sobering, but I think ultimately, hopefully will be pretty useful to folks.
Well, apparently you did a good job. It made the Commander's Reading List. So let me start asking you some questions about your book now. In your introductory chapter, you state that the commonly accepted narrative in Washington, D.C. for fixing security assistance can be summed up in one word. And that one word is more. More training, more equipment, more people, more money, more help, and more quickly. However, ma'am, you go on to argue that more is not necessarily the answer. Can you explain why?
Absolutely. You know, we have this problem of increased state fragility, this challenge where states can't actually fulfill their number one duty, right? They can't actually maintain a monopoly on violence. We go with kind of Max Weber's thinking. So they can't, they can't create internal security. This fragility increasingly affects the United States. You see that post World War II, you see that post 9/11, but we don't want to deal with it ourselves, right? We generally don't want to send the US military in kind of large swaths to kind of deal with these problems for a whole bunch of reasons. And so we need to find this way to stabilize fragile states cheaply, to do so cheaply in blood, in treasure, and in time. And for a long period, I found the answer was do it by taking the approach of more hardware, give assistance more quickly, more, better, faster, yesterday is kind of how I like to think about it. And it seems to me that that's actually pretty flawed. It's flawed because it ignores, frankly, the US system. We have the system of checks and balances, a system that ultimately just doesn't move that quickly. I should note, I have this sort of fear of romanticizing authoritarianism that probably seeps into this a little bit. So it's really hard just operationally for us to meet this kind of demand of more. And increasingly, what I found in the research is that more actually doesn't do what you need. The right question to really ask is how. How are we working with these militaries? It's generally not the stuff that they need. It's learning how. It's rethinking how their military operates, who's leading their military's mission. Really reconceptualizing how we are working with these militaries. And so more is not just flawed and impossible, but it's also really dangerous because it leads you to thinking, if I can get them X or Y assistance just a little bit faster, it's all going to work out. And that generally doesn't come together. I have this one case study that sort of hit me pretty hard, particularly because I was a participant in it. But there was this extraordinary moment in 2007 where the US had been working with the Lebanese military for a couple years to try to strengthen it against kind of various problematic internal and external actors. And the Lebanese military was fighting its first real fight, arguably ever, to be frank, but definitely in decades. And the US raced a ton of assistance. We raced 40 C-130s and C-17s brimming with assistance. And you would turn on Lebanese television and you'd literally see the planes landing at Beirut International Airport and then flying right to where this engagement was happening with the Lebanese military against this Al-Qaeda affiliate. So there was no guessing, could it have been faster? Could it have been more? That all seemed to have occurred at this kind of extraordinary moment. And yet the US got zero credit for doing this. The head of the military said, we didn't get anything but promises and best wishes and some ammunition. It's as though the Americans are telling us die first and assistance will follow. Lebanese television mocked U.S. assistance. They showed, kind of satirical U.S. government officials handing out socks and toy airplanes to Lebanese generals. And that moment was sort of so spectacular that when coupled with all of the research on the other cases really made me rethink this idea that more, better, faster, yesterday is kind of meeting the needs that we want.
Yeah, I think that might be difficult to get over because that is generally how we think, though.
Absolutely, right? If we just run at the hill a little bit faster, we will succeed. And that's actually a misguided approach.
Right. Well, ma'am, I'd like to read you a quote that you wrote and ask you to comment on it, please. When you discussed achieving the desired outcome of building a partner military, you wrote, if the United States gets deeply involved in the partner states' sensitive military affairs, and if antagonistic external threats play a diminishing role, then the partner state military is more likely to establish internal defense. Will you please expand upon and explain your conclusion?
Absolutely. So what does that actually mean in English, right? It seems to me success is that the partner state has a sustainable monopoly on violence, not the US military, right? So they're dealing with this problem. We've helped them a little bit, but generally they're dealing with the problem. It's not us. It's not the US military that's trying to do so. And what I found in sort of making in this conclusion is that it's really important for us to acknowledge two crucial things. And the first I should note is terribly discomfiting, but it is that all state building endeavors, like building a military, is a political, not a technical exercise. And that when we distance from key political issues, we're wasting time, we're wasting effort, we're wasting resources. So effectively, what I'm saying here is we've had a fundamentally flawed approach on the whole when we've tried to think of building militaries as just a technical exercise, right? This is, we build them by spreadsheet. We've given them XYZ assistance. They can now do A or B. And along these lines, the biggest problem is really that Washington has been reluctant to weigh in on higher order issues, right? Higher order questions vis-a-vis a partner military of their mission, of their organizational structure, and their personnel, all of which we know profoundly affect a military's capabilities, right? And they're just considered too sensitive to touch. So we want to narrowly focus on training and narrowly focus in on equipment. But really, based on this finding, I'm arguing that we have to acknowledge this is a political exercise. The US has to be willing to use its influence and push on all sorts of terribly sensitive issues. The other piece of my conclusion is that we have to acknowledge there are destabilizing third parties that pose a serious challenge to a newly equipped military. Effectively, we often want to see this as a bilateral exercise. It's the US and the partner military, but actually there's a multiplicity of actors out there, some of whom do not want this to succeed. So we need to both acknowledge that and also consider the circumstances under which we may want to push those external actors. And if we don't want to push them for various reasons, maybe we have more important issues to deal with vis-a-vis those actors, we need to at least acknowledge that there will be limits to that success.
Okay, thank you. We do have one question from our audience, but I'm going to wait until we go through the next two questions because I think it would be a good follow-on afterwards. Ma'am, the next two questions are going to be discussing really the bulk of your book, which are your case studies. In your book, you dedicate a chapter each to case studies from 4 different time periods. You used Greece post-World War II, South Vietnam in the 1950s, Lebanon in the early 1980s, and then Lebanon again in the mid-2000s. So the first part of this 2-part question, and I'll just do the one part, why did you choose these particular cases?
Absolutely. I was looking for variation. So I wanted to find regional variation. Most of my background has been focused on Middle East security issues. So it was important to see that whatever I was going to come up with as a conclusion didn't just work within the Middle East security box. So I wanted to look for regional variation. I also wanted to look for temporal variation. It's really easy, I think, for so many of us to think of building militaries in fragile states and the by, with, and through mantra as kind of a newer phenomenon, but it really isn't. It's one that the US has particularly pursued pretty actively post-World War II. So I thought by looking at the regional and temporal variation, I might come up with richer conclusions. And then what was great fun about the Lebanon cases is that you had, it was possible to sort of fix the country I was looking at and to have profound variation within it. So I found that to be pretty textured.
Okay, so now the second part then would be, and you've kind of touched on it a bit, but using those case studies, those 4 in your book, can you please provide us an overview of the lessons learned of each case?
Absolutely. And it's probably good at this point for me to kind of make a broad comment, which is our options are generally terrible when we're looking at building militaries in fragile states. Folks will often say to me, really? You're looking at Greece after World War II and saying the US effort there was a success? Greece goes through a pretty bumpy couple decades after that. And my argument is that is absolutely true. But when we're looking at building militaries in fragile states, when we're looking at these sorts of by, within, through operations, there are no butterflies and unicorns. Your options are not great, range from not great all the way to kind of catastrophic. And if you can get some sort of minimal level of the partner state exerting the monopoly on violence, not the U.S. military, where you don't see the need to send large numbers of U.S. troops, that actually is a pretty decent outcome. So you had asked a little bit about the lessons learned. So what I found is that it's important to look at the nature of U.S. involvement in particular in trying to see when the U.S. can be more successful. And what I found is when the U.S. weighs in to try to shape the partner military's mission and organizational structure and personnel, that's pretty meaningful. And also that on the US side, having capable people, having a unity of vision, both in the field and in Washington, is important. And finally, that it's really important for the US to have these very hard discussions on becoming a co-combatant, on assessing, when the US role needs to shift, when this can no longer be a by, with, and through effort, and needs to really just be a direct effort. So why don't I spend a moment kind of walking through the Greece case, because I think it's a really colorful one, and I can kind of bring some of these examples to life. So Greece, just after World War II, is not the Greece of your summer vacation, right? Greece after World War II looks a lot more like Syria today. It's a hideous, utterly dysfunctional mess. You've seen the country just utterly ravaged by the war. There's rampant starvation and disease. There are real questions about whether or not this country can actually even continue to exist. And what was so extraordinary to me when I was researching it was to see, frankly, how much the US was mucking around as it worked to build the Greek military. The US had hard conversations, not just internally, but also, so not just within the family, but also vis-a-vis the partner state, to talk about the Greek military's mission, to make sure that the mission we wanted the Greeks to focus on, internal defense, was also what they were going to focus on. The US helped reorganize the Greek military so that it was able to focus on the guerrillas and exerting internal defense, not on foreign armies. The US mucked around in all sorts of ways in shaping Greek military personnel, really overseeing a complete overhaul of the Greek military leadership, including pushing for a new chief of staff, getting all of the lieutenant generals except one to resign, facilitating the promotion and placement of a number of major generals, encouraging the removal of division and corps commanders who weren't supporting the broader strategy. It was kind of mind-blowing, frankly, when I was doing the research to find all of that. You had this extraordinary unity of vision among the US actors, both in Athens and also in Washington. You had a superstar put in to run the effort to build the Greek military, someone who had shined throughout World War II in particular. And then within Washington, you had a lot of really hard discussions. You had a regular battle rhythm of interagency discussions, assessing the program and really asking the question about when and whether the US needed to kind of reformulate its approach. Did the US military need to take a more direct approach, or could it continue really working by, within, through the Greek military? And this was all just really kind of eye-opening to me when I looked at some of the other examples. When I looked at Vietnam, for example, I think for many of us, when we think about the Vietnam War, right, our story really starts when the US starts to play this combat role. But there's this massive effort to build the South Vietnamese military beforehand, right? The US spends $500 million in assistance trying to build the South Vietnamese military beforehand. It's an effort run by an utterly incompetent and rather toxic leader, Hanging Sam Williams, right? Someone who had literally been demoted multiple times, right? Who had a terrible relationship with the US ambassador in country, and who wasn't willing to push his South Vietnamese partner. And it's really just kind of extraordinary to me to look at that example and think, gosh, Imagine if we had gotten that right? Imagine if that had happened. At a minimum, 58,000 Americans don't die in the Vietnam War. So these lessons learned, are not just important. I think they're actually pretty vital.
Right, right. Well, thank you. I want to go to the question from our online audience right now because it has to deal with the case study. So I think it's a good segue here. The question reads, what level of training did you see of U.S. advisors in security cooperation cases that you analyzed? And I'd actually like to expand that to what level of education, what level of proficiency, and were they able to see the big picture in what they were doing?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So I looked at training from all different levels. I mean, really, from the most tactical up to the most senior, including particularly institution building. So where you had folks, say, advising the Minister of Defense directly. And what I found is a lot of variance in terms of folks' understanding of and appreciation of the broader strategic picture. And probably unsurprising to a lot of folks here, their ability to understand that big picture and then to offer feedback was kind of meaningfully shaped by the leader of the U.S. effort in country. So I'll dive a little bit deeper here on both the Greece example and the Vietnam example. So I had briefly mentioned, that the Greek effort is run by a pretty capable fellow, Lieutenant General James Van Fleet. He had been a superstar in World War II. He, as far as I could tell, reading a number of advisory reports, set up this pretty healthy command climate where the folks working for him were able to bring him out to the field a lot, were able to show him what was working and what wasn't working. And he was then able to use that to push various Greek military and frankly political leaders to make changes. That was a pretty stark difference when I looked at the fellow who ran the program in South Vietnam, who I briefly mentioned, Lieutenant General Sam Williams. He was just an utterly toxic leader who clashed with just about everyone. And when you read the advisory reports, it's kind of extraordinary to see how they shift in tone soon after he comes. Soon after he comes to Saigon. Effectively, it becomes very clear to all of the trainers that he doesn't want to hear anything bad. He only wants to hear that things out in the field are going really well, that the South Vietnamese are performing admirably. And when you start to read then the quarterly reports, it's, you kind of the hair on your arms goes up a little bit because you realize folks are having trouble and they're not in a command climate where they can actually articulate that to their boss, who is someone saying, I don't want any bad mouthing of our partners, who is clearly kind of forgetting what the broader strategic picture is. Unsurprisingly, he's also not terribly enthusiastic in the direction he gets from Washington, which appears to actually, in retrospect, be a lot more kind of forward-thinking than he was.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Just to follow up on that same question, though, obviously the leadership sets the climate. A toxic environment is you're going to have bad morale, and everything's just going to probably go south from there. But for the U.S. advisors that were actually showing up, were they trained adequately to do the job? I believe is sort of the essence of the question.
Absolutely. Generally not. They generally don't have much background in the country that they're working with. They rarely have language skills, so they're heavily dependent on the folks in country who may or may not have the same agenda as them from the partner military, of course. What I found is generally the sort of training they get, and I should emphasize this is a little bit of a different story than Iraq and Afghanistan, which I'm sure we'll get to later on in the discussion. But generally the training they get is much more focused on tactics and operations, right? Here's how you teach someone to use their weapon, which is great if we take the Excel spreadsheet approach. But it turns out that that's actually pretty misguided. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. And for our online audience, again, if you have any other questions, please submit them through the Q&A icon. Ma'am, in order to effectively build a military in a fragile state, both the donor state and, for our purposes, the United States, as well as the partner state, must, for lack of a better phrase, sort of hold up their end of the bargain.
Mhm.
Can you please discuss more about what the responsibilities are of the donor and the partner state, and what are the necessary tasks for this to be successful?
Absolutely. You know, first and foremost, I think it's really important to have a frank conversation inside the family, right? To be able to have those hard discussions about what the US actually wants and what is actually feasible vis-a-vis this partner state. And then you can start engaging with the partner state to figure out what the parameters are and what the limits are. But it's what I would often find, and I will say this in particular based on my experience as a practitioner trying to do this for a number of years, is a little bit of pablum, to be completely frank, right? Where we would kind of think up the most kind of vague strategic end state. I'm sure folks who've worked on, defense strategy, et cetera, are sort of finding that they've had this experience as well. And then we weren't really digging down a little bit more deeply to say, so what do we really want, and what's actually, no kidding, possible here? So the biggest change that I would really love to see, and I'm pretty impressed with the changes that Secretary Mattis has started to make when he was SecDef, what was this kind of more consistent approach to kind of monitoring, assessment, and evaluation, figuring out what we want and figuring out what's actually possible. Then we can have the conversations with the partner state.
Okay, thank you. Twice during our interview in the last 30 minutes, you've used the phrase by, with, and through. And of course, in US SOCOM, we hear that phrase by, with, and through quite a bit, as it refers to working with our partners and our allies. Recently, a previous US SOCOM commander testified in Congress that by, with, and through is the primary approach to achieve the command's objectives. In your opinion, how effective is this approach today in fragile states? And do you know of any recent successes and or failures using this approach?
Absolutely. So the first point I would make is by, with, and through is not new. And it's really important that we recognize that. It is our hot catchphrase. 10 years ago, Secretary Gates was saying something very similar, right? A couple decades before, we saw President Truman also saying that. So it is important for us to internalize. It's not kind of this new idea. It's also not a panacea. I had mentioned earlier that that our options when we're trying to build militaries in fragile states often range from not so great to kind of catastrophic and hideous. And I do think that is important, because you're asking, what does success look like? How do we really think about success? And the best way to answer that is really to start with the first order question of, what are you trying to achieve, right? What are we, no kidding, trying to get done? And so I'll answer your question on success, but let me do so by underscoring that success may not be terribly satisfying. And in fact, the first example I'll give, I think, is one in which is working with the Syrian opposition to severely weaken ISIS. So operationally, this was actually a pretty successful by, with, and through effort. The US military was able to keep a pretty small presence, and it was through US assistance and getting involved in a number of different sensitive affairs with the Syrian opposition to help them really kind of dramatically weaken ISIS. And yet strategically, there's a whole lot of problems that have come out of that relationship, right? It was a relationship that was, at least according to kind of various SecDefs, supposed to be transactional. And I think particularly given that folks were just especially excited to have a partner that was both capable and willing to fight, it increasingly bled into something that wasn't transactional, which meant that we had sort of missed that kind of very first point, recognizing what are we trying to do and why are we trying to do it. So
Right.
Operationally, I think that worked very well. And I think it is awkward and discomfiting for us to acknowledge that strategically, we purchased a whole bunch of problems by taking that approach. Other relations that have worked pretty well, particularly more recently, has been working with the counterterrorism service in Iraq. That, compared to the broader effort of working with the Iraqi military, has been pretty successful these are the folks that I think really kind of demonstrated a lot of capability in countering ISIS over the last few years in particular. Unsurprisingly, they also kind of were at a different caliber than the broader Iraqi military. And I think the US was therefore able to set up a different sort of relationship with them. But when we're trying to look at successes, it does come down to what are you trying to get done and how. I would actually argue more recently, the US effort with the Lebanese military has worked out pretty decently. For about $2 billion or so over the last kind of just a decade and a half or so, they've been able to deal with mutually agreed threats like Al-Qaeda affiliates, ISIS types, etc. They're not going to be able to deal with fundamental security challenges, at least not in the way that one would want them to, coming from the US. So I think having a low bar is probably not the worst idea when we're thinking about success.
Okay, thank you. I want to take another question from our audience right now, and because you were just talking about what is our measure of success, and the question is actually along that same line. I'll read the question to you. Concerning the Lebanon example, how important is it that the Lebanese leadership did not give credit to the United States? Is that not to be expected to a certain degree? Is increasing the ability of a nation to counter mutual adversaries the priority, or is the partner-state relationship the priority?
Oh, absolutely the former. Absolutely, right? At the end of the day, it is all well and good, and I'm probably one of the biggest advocates of alliances and partnerships. I think it is America's comparative advantage. There's a reason folks want to be on our team and not on Beijing or Moscow's team, and that's a good thing, and we should do what we can to facilitate it. That said, there's a purpose to these relationships, and we've got to be able to sort of soberly acknowledge that. If the partnership doesn't actually involve the partner state, whether the military or other parts, generally doing things you want, then it's probably time to reassess that. I think the reason I use that example with Lebanon is it's just so spectacular to me, because it's one thing to not publicly kind of welcome U.S. assistance. What was extraordinary to me is that they were publicly criticizing it, right? And doing all they could at the senior leadership level to talk about all of the problems with it, to deny, frankly, facts on the ground about it happening. And it was a great example to me, in addition to the one I'm about to use, of how our dialogue with our partners is just so difficult. We thought that, frankly, the U.S. had done something pretty historic in getting all of this assistance there so quickly at this crucial moment. And we were sort of talking past our partners in Lebanon when that turned out not to be the case. And frankly, talking past one another came to a head about a year later as well. So let me give you color, a little bit of color about a moment that happened just over a decade ago in 2008. In 2008, the Lebanese government took a bunch of pretty controversial decisions, frankly, that put Hezbollah kind of on its back feet. And Hezbollah, effectively what the Lebanese government tried to do is they tried to neuter the Hezbollah's communications network and its special access at Beirut International Airport. And the response was that Hezbollah took to the streets, and it grabbed its weapons and effectively started using them against the Lebanese people. And what was so extraordinary to me at that moment was you had key Lebanese leaders trapped in their homes, and they all started calling the US saying, when are you going to send in the Marines? Of course, the US wasn't going to become a co-combatant, right? We had seen that movie before in Lebanon in particular, and realized that a very fuzzy mission can be profoundly problematic, plus, a dysfunctional interagency process. And yet, that wasn't clear to our partners. And I thought that that was pretty dangerous and unhealthy, that we needed both internally to think hard about when and under what circumstances one would become a co-combatant, but we also needed to communicate that to our partners.
Okay, well, I'm going to take another question from our online audience, and because everyone who's attending has a relationship with the United States Special Operations Command. either operator or support of some nature. This question is really about special operations or special operations forces. And the question reads, did you find a significant differences in the results for assistance operations using U.S. forces specifically trained for assistance mission, like special forces or combat aviation advisors, versus the results in operations conducted by conventional forces?
That's a superb question, and I think it's an area for further research. The ones I looked at, you had a special forces component generally, but it was a much broader effort as well, and I didn't distinguish between those. So I think it would be pretty interesting. I can say anecdotally, you know, we've got some examples that show, if we look, say, at the Iraqi CTS services, for example, if we look at the special forces work with the Lebanese special forces. I mean, I think there's a couple examples that show that yes, probably your community does a better job than the broader community. Frankly, I think it'll be really interesting to see where this community goes over the coming years, because I think there's some really interesting dilemmas about the extent to which, you know, the SOCOM community focuses on working with partner militaries, helping them deal with terrorism and insurgency, versus the challenge posed by a great power competition, which is obviously sort of, you know, increasingly the kind of hot topic that folks are getting drawn to.
Okay, and here's another question about your research. This is from our online audience as well. The question says, did you see any examples of transfer of techniques from one experience to another? And the person uses the quote that during certain educational courses, many of the advisor or training, many of the advisors will start off with, well, when I was in Iraq, we did it this way, or when I was in Afghanistan, we did it that way. So the question is, did you see any transfer of techniques that were valuable?
That's a really interesting question. First of all, spot on for asking the question, because we all start with our own experience, right? We're all shaped by our own experience, and there's an inevitability to that. You know, it's really interesting to me that you have Lieutenant General James Van Fleet, the superstar I mentioned, who was building the Greek military, who then heads out to Korea, right? Early in the Korean War. And I think you could argue that the U.S. relationship with the South Korean military has worked out pretty decently, although there is kind of the fundamental challenge that you still have 28,500 troops there, of course, from the U.S. side. So the fact that you had someone who sort of kind of knew how to do this and sort of, fit the model and then did it well, and I think was able to do it pretty decently again, that's pretty meaningful. This is actually, I think, an interesting moment to bring up Iraq and Afghanistan. Because one thing we've seen in those cases over the last 2 decades or so has been often a real lack of willingness to muck around, right? So effectively, what I'm arguing is you're more likely to succeed when you muck around in these sensitive issues. And you know, while this is discomfiting probably for all of us, we don't think about kind of pushing a military's mission, organizational structure, or new personnel on them. I think if we were in probably just about any other field, this would be pretty obvious, right? We've all worked with the good boss versus the toxic boss. We've all worked in an org structure that makes sense versus an utterly dysfunctional one, or one where kind of the mission wasn't clear. So what you see in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular is a real lack of willingness to muck around in sensitive affairs. We've sort of overcorrected, I think, from looking at previous examples where understandably there was this view that the US didn't, say, understand the South Vietnamese military, didn't understand the South Vietnamese way of doing things. And the overcorrection, that approach really has manifested as not wanting to push partners, not willing to muck around. And I think that is not ideal. I've started to see some shifts, I should emphasize, in recent years in the approach to partner militaries, but that's a much more recent story.
Right. Okay. Well, that was certainly one of my questions. I was going to ask you about the lessons that you learned with your case studies, if they were to how we could apply them to Iraq and Afghanistan. But Leslie, I'm
Actually,
going to,
if you don't mind, could I jump in? Because so obviously there's the point I made earlier, but I would just emphasize it's important that we recognize Iraq and Afghanistan are kind of a different ballgame, right? I mean, you're talking about huge numbers of U.S. troops that are going to these places, and that's generally not what we're doing when we're trying to build militaries in fragile states. I mean, what the effect there. I mean, it's almost like a more akin to a colonial relationship where you have this overwhelming presence in a country. So it seems to me we just need to recognize those are sort of different, because frankly the U.S. then gets involved in all sorts of areas around a country. It's funny. Oftentimes when I'm talking to folks about the book, they'll say, "Gosh, aren't you a little bit bothered that when you're just talking about building militaries? What about all the other institutions in a state?"
Right.
And I bring that up because I sure would like for us to have these broader efforts to stabilize fragile states that don't just involve the guys with guns, right? I think a much healthier and much more thoughtful approach to working with fragile states is to look at them holistically. That said, it's just generally not going to happen, right? We're going to spend a whole lot less effort doing that. Frankly, partner states are often a whole lot less interested in us getting involved in those issues. And by working with the military, that can provide an anchor toward a broader relationship.
right. Well, the next question is going to come from me because I want to make sure we have time to ask it. Ma'am, in your role as a senior civilian policymaker in the U.S. Department of Defense, you led the effort to strengthen the military security capability of many states, including Lebanon, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Jordan, the Palestinian Authority. As a 3-time veteran of the Pentagon myself, and that's why I'm asking this question, I'm aware of the many challenges our bureaucracy can create. Can you please describe some of the firsthand challenges you encountered, as well as some of the successes you achieved with your security building capabilities?
Absolutely. One of the reasons I really enjoyed kind of going through this research project is because I think after you've been a practitioner, like so many of the folks on this call, you have sort of a different level of understanding of what's feasible. So when I was digging around, in the archives and reading about just the utter dysfunctionality, say, surrounding the Marines in Lebanon, 1982 to 1984. I think it helped that I had seen interagency dysfunctionality, and that I understood what it meant when you have a special. I feel badly lying to an American ambassador, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? So I had sort of seen all of these terrible things. So providing a little bit of color, I've kind of already given some examples related to Lebanon. I'll offer one in particular on Pakistan. I'm guessing a bunch of folks on this call have also gotten to touch the utterly unsatisfying project that is working with the Pakistani military. But I worked with them not long after 9/11, of course, where the U.S. is really trying to kind of restart this relationship that had kind of gone off the rails for a whole bunch of reasons, and really needs the Pakistani military to start taking some crucial steps against bad actors that they had been supporting. And a couple things were particularly notable to me. So first was just how willing we were to try to throw money at the problem. As sort of a whippersnapper in the Pentagon, I remember being very confused that none of my counterparts were able to show what the Pakistani military had been doing. There was a program, Coalition Support Funds program, that I'm sure many folks here are familiar with, in which the Pakistanis would say, "We did these engagements and now give us many millions of dollars." And in my role, teamed that up to the SecDef, whose job it was to then say, "Yes, I concur, we should give them many millions of dollars." I found that no one was really able for years to be able to say the extent to which these activities had actually happened, how well they had gone, if the Pakistani military was getting more and less capable. But frankly, there was this desperation, and I say this with profound sympathy, obviously. There was this desperation after 9/11 to just see if we could throw money at the problem. And it turned out it didn't really work terribly well. I'd also say vis-a-vis Pakistan, it took a long time, I think, for folks across the Pentagon and probably the broader interagency to be able to acknowledge that as much as we cared about what Pakistan was doing to undermine security and stability in Afghanistan, we simultaneously had massive and profound concerns about Pakistan's nuclear weapons program, and that was always going to play an outsized role. And that really makes me think about this point I made earlier of the inside the family discussion versus the conversation with the partner. It is okay inside the family to be able to say, you know what, we care about Afghanistan's security and stability, but Pakistan's nuclear weapons are a much bigger concern, and we've got to do what we can to maintain a relationship with them on it. It's sort of okay to say that internally, while perhaps not acknowledging in the same way to either of our partners.
Right, right. Okay, well, thank you. You sort of touched on this throughout the conversation, but we have a question from our online audience, and it's regarding the two Lebanon case studies. And the person is asking if you could discuss the two case studies in relation to the changes in the U.S. approaches, basically what worked and what didn't work between Lebanon of 1980 and Lebanon of the 00s.
Absolutely. I can talk about Lebanon for hours and hours. So whoever asked this question, please feel free to reach out because we can spend a lot of time. I personally think Lebanon is the most interesting country in the Middle East. And if you want to try to understand the Middle East whatsoever on any level, Lebanon's the place to study. All right, so 82 is really interesting. The kind of very quick story is the Lebanese are engaged in this totally kind of unbelievable civil war. It ends up lasting for 15 years. There are so many different groups involved that you can't count, right? It's literally impossible to tell how many different kind of groups are involved here, and keeping track of them is a mess. And by the way, all sorts of external actors are mucking around. You name it, from across the region and also kind of geopolitically. And what ends up happening here is a fascinating story because on one level, the U.S. is willing to push on sensitive affairs. It's the U.S. that pushes for a new military commander, a fellow named General Ibrahim Tanous, who's really impressive. He actually finds out that he got the job while he's on his drive to work. He hears it on the radio. He had never even met the Lebanese president at that time, but he had been recommended by the Americans. Really, he was an extraordinary fellow. So the U.S. is willing to push on a pretty sensitive issue. And yet, the U.S. cannot seriously think about this issue of becoming a co-combatant. So the kind of case study that we're all so familiar with here, of course, is the Marines, right, being sent as peacekeepers. And what's amazing is at first, the Marine peacekeeping mission actually is a total success. The entire purpose is for them to go in, spend 30 days there overseeing the withdrawal of the Palestine Liberation Organization personnel from Beirut, and then to sail away. And that actually works. The PLO personnel sail away, and then the U.S., the Marines do as well. And then, as the Marines are sailing away, there's this horrific tragedy, the Sabra and Shatila massacres conducted by these Christian militias, with at least the knowledge of the Israeli military. And President Reagan is just kind of beside himself. And he says, oh my goodness, we've got to do something here. So he sends the Marines back, but the mission is fuzzy. What are they doing there? They're no longer there to get the PLO out. And so it gets really confusing because the U.S. is trying to say they are peacekeepers. They are not involved in the fighting. And yet, the Marines are getting combat pay after their first year there. The USS New Jersey is firing on the Syrian military and various militias inside Lebanon. And so unsurprisingly, it's really fuzzy. You know, what was kind of extraordinary to me is that President Reagan writes in his diary the first night that he has the USS New Jersey start firing, and he says this still comes under the heading of self-defense, right? It's obviously not the case for anyone that you're firing under. And I think it's just a terrible story of this unwillingness to break this kind of utterly dysfunctional interagency dynamic and to be able to figure out what is the Marines' mission, right? And therefore, it's not terribly surprising that various bad actors end up blowing up the Marine barracks, end up blowing up the U.S. Embassy. And then, of course, the U.S. heads out. So 82 is kind of a spectacular example to me about why you've got to have those hard conversations on becoming a co-combatant. But there is the silver lining that to the extent you're willing to put someone capable in, the military can actually do some goodness. And we do see some examples of the military trying to fight against various bad actors. But really, there's just so many of them. It's kind of extraordinary. So that's kind of the first case study. The more recent one is, to me, a story of kind of having really low expectations. And that's why I would call it, kind of a half decent example over the years. Obviously, I finished this book a few years ago, but I'd probably offer a kind of a smidge more optimism about how it's gone than I did in the book, but really just a smidge. What you had here is really the U.S. unwilling to push the military on any of these sensitive issues. So it's a great story, I think, for the special ops community, which has worked so well with the Lebanese military's Rangers. But you've really just seen kind of minimal success working against ISIS types and Al-Qaeda affiliates. And there's something to that. I mean, the fact that that's only cost about $2 billion over almost 2 decades is not a bad story whatsoever. But we really haven't been willing to push the Lebanese military seriously up until the last few years, where I think there has been kind of a little more effort along those lines.
Right. Well, ma'am, I thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question, and this is going to come from our online folks, and it's about South America. The question is, would you agree that U.S. policy was successful in El Salvador and Colombia? It says neither is a communist state, but both are still suffering from crime and violence, and drugs are still flowing into the United States.
Absolutely. So we need a lot of time to talk about those. So maybe I'll just really briefly hit Colombia.
Sure.
Colombia is such an interesting one to me because it has something that, frankly, many of these cases don't, which is kind of profound domestic U.S. interest. So within our community, right, we may find all of these examples interesting, and we want to know, what's happening with the Syrian opposition or the Lebanese military, or kind of, various actors. But Colombia is different because it's so deeply tied to the narcotics problem. In some ways, I actually think that makes it a little bit easier, because it means you have a kind of overwhelming congressional interest in pushing a ton of resources towards the problem. It means that you've got a senior political leadership that can't avoid it because of kind of this domestic element. And so I think that's why it's just a little bit different. Of course, kind of the magnitude is also different because you've got just so much narcotics money flowing in, and that's I think been pretty meaningful. I'll be really curious to watch how Colombia plays out over these next few years. There was obviously the sort of peace accord reconciliation effort a couple of years ago, and that appears to have been pretty bumpy. And it seems as though kind of the narcotics challenge is absolutely continuing, and that the violence is as well. So, on one level, Colombia is a pretty decent story because of the extent to which the threat, if you will, the violence has managed to be contained. On another level, it's actually pretty problematic because the fundamental reason the U.S. cares is not because of internal defense. It cares because of kind of this narcotics flow.
Right. Well, thank you very much, ma'am. You've been a great sport. Before we sign off, though, I'd like to give you an opportunity. You've got a U.S. SOCOM audience here. Are there any final words you'd like to close up with?
Absolutely. So here's what I would say. I'm pushing for folks to be comfortable thinking about sensitive issues, dealing with their partner state, and I'm pushing for them to be comfortable recognizing that this isn't a bilateral conversation, but that there are all sorts of external actors, many of whom are nefarious, who want to undermine what we're doing. And you may have sat through all of this and said, well, that's all really interesting, but it's just not feasible, right? You're telling me to muck around, and I don't think it's possible in the example I'm working with. Maybe the partner I'm working with doesn't want to talk about these higher order sensitive questions because they don't trust me. Maybe they don't want to because they have a different agenda. Maybe they think we're going to give them money anyway. Or perhaps the US is unwilling to really crack down on the various nefarious actors. And so, effectively everything I'm saying, it's just not possible. And so if you were sitting here thinking that, what I would beg of you to do is to make a clear-eyed assessment about the goals and the likely outcomes of the program you're working on. And if you make that clear-eyed assessment about the goals and the likely outcomes of the program you're working on, I think you will find that if this is impossible, one of two things is. One, you're going to move forward with this program, and you're going to conduct light security sector reform. And that is absolutely fine, right? We can do limited train and equip efforts, and there's some utility in that. Maybe you'll pick up some intel. Maybe you'll help professionalize that military. Maybe you'll get some professionalization. Maybe you'll get some operational cooperation on mutually agreed threats. That is all good, as long as you recognize that limited US involvement will have a limited impact. You may also conclude that actually the costs outweigh the benefits here, and that running a program to build a military in a fragile state where you're not able to deal with these nefarious external actors, where you're not able to get involved in sensitive military affairs, means that actually you're throwing good money after bad, and maybe it's just not worthwhile. Thank you all so much. This was great fun.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Karlin, for sharing their time and expertise with us today. Folks, this topic really is extremely important to the United States Special Operations Command, and we all know that. Given the complex security global environment, limited US defense budgets, and an increasingly connected and often unstable world, the United States has an ever-growing interest in strengthening fragile states. And unfortunately, as Dr. Karlin points out, our record of success in this area is thin in some places. Ma'am, the findings in your book, Building Militaries in Fragile States, suggest the traditional way of working with foreign militaries must be rethought. So thank you again for sharing your thoughts with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you all so much for having me.
And for our online audience, for feedback on this session or any Think JSOW activity, please contact us at thinkjsow@socom.mil. I'd like to close by once again encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOW collection by subscribing through the library or on one of the social media channels on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and APAN. Also, the US SOCOM Library is an exceptional resource for checking out electronic books, such as Dr. Karlin's, or to download past and present JSOW monographs through our JSOW Press. And of course, everyone can check out upcoming courses and events on our website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. This series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University, and I want to thank everyone for attending.